Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. By way of introduction, I'm Kylie Atwood. I'm a CNN national security correspondent, and I am here to welcome Senator Chris Murphy. We're going to be broadly discussing the future of progressive foreign policy. If we want to bring him in now. And just to give you guys a little bit of background, Senator Murphy is the United States Senator from Connecticut. He has focused a tremendous amount of his time since joining the Senate in 2013 on foreign policy, healthcare, and gun laws. And he has been a real player in the realm of developing a vision for foreign policy that he is deeming to be the progressive foreign policy. And there are, folks that you talk to on Capitol Hill who discuss who are the influential players in the foreign policy world, and Senator Murphy is always one of them. So he is currently a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He's been an outspoken proponent of diplomacy, human rights, American leadership abroad, and he's also the top Democrat on the subcommittee on the Near East, South Asia, Central Asia, counterterrorism, and the former chairman of the subcommittee on Europe and Eurasia. So, Senator, I think you have it covered in terms of everything you've focused on. And I do want to get to your vision for progressive foreign policy. I think it's something that everyone here is interested in. But before we dive in there, I think we have to open by discussing the breaking news this morning with President Trump testing positive for COVID-19. There are national security implications there. And given your expertise and what you know about how the U.S. government works and how it should be working at a time like right now, which is a moment of crisis, I'm curious what you view as the national security implications here, broadly speaking.
Well, great. Kylie, thank you very much for doing this. Excited to share the next 45 minutes or so with you and all of the guests. Thanks to Truman for being such a great and positive partner to me and my work, and to my colleagues on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. First and foremost, it cannot go without saying that this is a deadly and insidious disease, and we're all rooting for the President, the First Lady, and everyone else who has been infected to get better in and around the White House. As you mentioned, you can't deny that there are security implications anytime that a president falls ill. I take Chief of Staff Meadows at his word that the president has not been incapacitated, that he has mild symptoms, that he's continuing to be able to function as the head of state. And I was glad that Mark Meadows came out and made that clear this morning. Our allies and our adversaries need to know that and understand, because we still have many of those on the latter list that are probing at our vulnerabilities. I think a lot about Iran, who I don't think is done with their campaign of retribution for Qasem Soleimani's assassination, and you wonder whether they would try to take advantage of a moment when the president may be at a lower level of capability and capacity. I trust and I hope that he is not. But I also think that the president's foreign allies in his reelection effort are going to make adjustments as well. I'm sure we're going to cover this over the course of this time, but I am convinced that the Russians are prepared to do anything and everything in order to get this president reelected. And knowing that he is going to be sidelined from at least normal campaigning over the next 2 weeks, it may mean that that's massive, multi-layered, octopus-like Russian interference operation is going to ramp up. And I think we all need to be cognizant of that, and we all need to be taking steps to try to make the American people understand what is real information from that being proffered by countries like Russia.
So if you think that the Russian disinformation is going to increase because the president isn't on the campaign trail, he can't be on the campaign trail for the next 2 weeks because he has the coronavirus, what should the U.S. government be doing to counter that potential surge in Russian disinformation? And how do you get that message out to the American people? Because I think, as you well know, there's a little bit of a desensitized populace here. Folks don't really understand what Russian disinformation means. So, how do you overcome that hurdle, and how do you prepare for a potential surge?
It's a great question, but to the extent there is a desensitization amongst the American public, it is in part because the American intel agencies, I think, have been essentially folded into the president's reelection campaign. And as part of that development, they have tried to whitewash Russian interference. They have held back disclosures about specific individuals and specific narratives that are central to Russian interference in the US election. And they've also tried to create an equivalency between what the Chinese and the Iranians may or may not be doing versus what the Russians are doing. There's zero equivalency. The Russians are the only foreign country that have both the intent and the capability to manipulate a US election. So I was very glad a few weeks ago that the Treasury Department, interestingly, finally released the fact that has been known to many of us for a long time, that Andrei Derkach, in contact with the highest levels of Trump's inner circle, making TV appearances on American networks, is in fact a Russian agent. But that's not the end of what the intel agencies know about Russian players and Russian narratives, and they need to disclose more specific information so that when the American public hear some of these stories, for instance, about Hunter Biden and money coming from Ukraine, they know where that story comes from. Many of those, if not all of those stories, originate with Russian agents and Russian propaganda outfits.
Yeah, it's definitely a different story when it's coming from someone who has a relationship with the president's personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, and when that person is now identified as a Russian agent, of course. But do you think, based on what you said, that there is intelligence that should be out there more publicly, do you think that the U.S. government is going to identify additional Russian agents in the coming weeks? And do you think that they should?
I don't think they are, unless there is enormous public pressure and bipartisan pressure for them to do so. I think it's not coincidental that they released their information on Derkach a day after a very damaging whistleblower complaint was made public. The top intel official at the Department of Homeland Security disclosed that he had gotten pressure through the White House to stop talking so much about Russian interference. And 24 hours later, Derkach's name became public. So I don't think the White House or the intel agencies have any plans to release additional information. That will only happen if we build that pressure. And that's why I have started to talk more about what I know and how it's inconsistent with what the intel agencies have told us to try to create that pressure campaign.
Yeah, Senator, when you talk about what you know, I mean, I know you can't get into the details of the intelligence, but broad strokes, the intelligence you've seen, your conversations with U.S. government officials in the different agencies in Washington, does anything indicate in those conversations that President Trump and his closest allies are actually embracing these Russian attempts to amplify disinformation about voter fraud, mail-in voting that are intended to undermine the election?
Well, I mean, I do have to be careful about how I talk about the things that I've read and been briefed upon. But I can just say this: it to me doesn't appear coincidental that the president's narratives, in some ways, duplicate the narratives that we know are being proffered by the Russians. In fact, if you look at the content online today regarding Reopen America campaigns, campaigns online to undermine mask wearing. Much of that, if not the majority of that, comes from foreign sources, likely Russia. And so whether they are following Trump's lead or whether there are any conversations happening, I can't tell you. I just am not sure that it's a coincidence.
Do you think the president could be learning from them?
Well, what we know is that the president had an unusually large number of phone calls directly with Vladimir Putin over the spring, right in the lead up to the final stretch run of this election. And I know in 2016 he was directly communicating to Vladimir Putin via press conference. I think it's entirely possible that in those conversations they talked about some of the narratives that Putin would be spreading and some of the narratives that Trump would be spreading. If they didn't, then maybe it is just a wild coincidence that they are almost identical.
And given a statement like that, the onus, I guess, then lies on figuring out what specifically was discussed in those phone conversations. How long do you think it'll be before we know some of the specificity and the content of those conversations?
So let's go back to last year when the president had a very troubling phone conversation with the president of Ukraine that those who listened to it believed violated U.S. law and was worthy of a whistleblower complaint. That, of course, led to the impeachment of the president. But since then, the president has undergone a dizzying campaign of retribution against anyone who, or nearly anyone, who testified against him in those hearings. And so the message has been sent. If you have been on the line, if you have heard one of these phone calls between the president and a foreign leader in which he says something that is perhaps illegal or worthy of dismissal from office, don't say anything, or you are going to have your reputation ruined and your job eliminated. So I don't know that we will ever know the content of those communications.
Gotcha. One more question on this, and then I promise we can shift to progressive foreign policy. But it does strike me that even after Derkash was sanctioned by the U.S. Treasury, determined to be, a longtime agent of Russia, he was still putting out disinformation. So after that happened, he still tried to put out some information about former Vice President Biden, and that gets confusing, and it makes you question the efficacy of these sanctions and of identifying someone as a Russian agent. So are there more things that should be done to prevent someone like that from releasing the information that they have that is trying to be destructive to the U.S. Presidential political system from even getting into the ecosystem?
Yeah, listen, that's what our intel agencies are supposed to exist for. And, the problem is, we knew who Derkach was a long time ago. And had we taken earlier steps to expose him, then it is likely that he wouldn't have developed as many contacts as he did and as many conduits as he did into the Trump administration and into the United States Congress. And so, in this case, while I can't necessarily speak to whether or not, there's perhaps a criminal case that can be brought against him as well as a sanctions case, it was not coincidental that the last time Secretary Pompeo was before the Foreign Relations Committee, I was asking him about Andrei Derkach, whether he was a credible voice in American politics. And it was just wild to me that the secretary, knowing what he knew at the time, would not go on the record about who Andrei Derkach was. That gave him time to sort of sow this narrative into the American public, one that the president continues to spread even in the last debate.
Yeah. Okay, so progressive foreign policy. You wrote this, and I want to read you a quote. So, a successful approach would be built around three elements: a clear articulation of the circumstances that justify the use of military force and those that don't, a recommitment to security and economic alliances, and most critically of all, a focus on building up the United States' non-military capabilities for dealing with challenges around the world. So I'm going to give you a softball here. What does building up non-military capabilities actually look like? Talk to me a little bit about that, because I understand what you're asking for, but putting specificity on it is what would actually accomplish any objective.
It's a great question, and let me sort of tell you why sort of I use this phrase, and many others use it: progressive foreign policy. I think as progressives today, who are generally first rooted in domestic politics, we have to admit there is no way to execute our domestic progressive goals, whether it be a growing of the economy for everyone, whether it be a victory on climate change, whether it be the protection of democracy, without having a foreign policy component. Because there is no way to protect our democracy unless you are actively meeting our adversaries abroad who want to destroy American democracy. There's no solution to climate change unless we are actively engaged diplomatically abroad. And the economy is global. So if you aren't working with other nations to write fair economic rules for the middle class, for poor people, then you aren't going to be able to achieve those gains simply on your own. So as progressives, we can't shrink from the world. We have to be active in it. But as I mentioned, and as you inquire about, we have to understand that the challenges posed to the United States today are by and large not conventional military challenges. There is not a real risk that there is going to be an invasion of the United States anytime soon. And today, of course, we are faced with maybe the most insidious and most classic non-military threat to the United States, a pandemic disease that we were not prepared for. So yes, I am talking about standing up new capabilities. They would certainly be a new commitment to global public health to make sure that a virus like this never is allowed to reach our shores. It would be a recommitment to climate change diplomacy. But let me take Russia as an example here, a very specific example. Why does it feel like we are sort of losing battle after battle with Russia? It is because we are engaged asymmetrically with Russia. Russia has propaganda tools that we can't meet. They are spending 10 times more money on information warfare than the United States is. It's because Russia is using its energy resources to bully and bribe countries in its periphery. And the United States spends virtually no money trying to make those same nations energy independent of Russia. It's because Russia engages in old-fashioned corruption, graft, and bribery. And we don't even have a class of anti-corruption officers that are dispensed around the globe to try to confront that challenge. And so, to me, creating a brand new first of class anti-propaganda operation in the State Department, creating a new cadre of officers dispensed to every embassy in the world whose number one and only job is confronting corruption, and spending real dollars on making countries like Moldova or Ukraine or even Belarus energy independent of Russia is a much better expenditure of dollars than the way that we are prioritizing military buildups along Russia's border today. So that's what I'm talking about with specificity.
How confident are you that should Vice President Biden win in November, that his team would be ready on day one to pick up this mantle and to actually, develop these non-military capabilities?
Well, I mean, he won't be ready on day one because he is going to first have to spend the majority of his time addressing the current crisis. So he is obviously going to have to prioritize getting COVID-19 under control and repairing our economy. And then second, he's just going to have to spend a couple months at least, maybe half a year, repairing our alliances. Because you can't do any of these things alone. There's no counter China strategy that doesn't involve very close hand-in-hand cooperation with Europe, for instance. And so he and his people are going to have to spend 6 months traveling the world, explaining exactly how we are going to recommit ourselves to these alliances that make a progressive foreign policy real.
Yeah, and they do talk about that a lot. But I think one of the things that diplomats at the State Department wonder is, okay, so what? So the U.S. is back on the world stage, and then what? Basically getting back into the Paris climate, agreement, and doing things like reaffirming our commitment to NATO, and those things are all good and wonderful if you are of the mind that those are necessary to make the United States as strong as it can be on the world stage. But then what? And so, what do you see as the things that need to be the actionable decisions that the Biden administration really kind of takes on immediately?
Well, let me answer that question in two ways. The first is to be specific about, what should be the nature of these renewed alliances. Listen, we do have to have a comprehensive and thoughtful strategy to manage China's rise. I think it's unrealistic to think we can prevent it, unhelpful to pretend that there is a strategy that achieves it. So managing China's rise so that we protect U.S. interests is the smart play. So let's immediately get into a conversation with the Europeans about exactly how to do that. Let's put together the blocking and tackling, an example of how we do that. The only way that you confront 6G or China's next move on AI or advanced battery technology is to understand that there is no pure private sector answer from America coming to compete with these new technologies that arrive on the world scene perfected and underpriced. So we've got to have an industrial policy. The United States and Europe have to get together and say, we're going to spend public money together with private sector money to make sure we don't get caught with our pants down ever again, like we did with Huawei on 5G. That's a specific strategy we can undertake. But second, Kylie, we also have to understand that our ability to rebuild these alliances will also be dependent on what we do domestically, right? We can't be credible after rejoining Paris unless we have passed a climate change bill of significant scope here in the United States. Our European neighbors aren't going to be really excited about going out and doing democracy promotion jointly unless we do some work at home and pass a new Voting Rights Act and take a hard look at the security of our elections. So there's never there's always a foreign policy benefit to getting stronger domestically. And so I don't think we should sort of think that if Biden spends the first 6 months focusing on passing domestic legislation, that doesn't have anything to do with our role in the world. We've just got to sort of repair ourselves in order to be a better advertisement for alliance across the globe.
Mm-hmm. So on a few things, I mean, strengthening the relationship with allies is hugely consequential, but then you have offered that really studying and reworking and upending, in some cases, our relationship with folks who have potentially done adversarial things should also be considered. So today, as actually your staff reminded me, is the 2-year anniversary of the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi. You've said that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has gotten away with murder and that the entire U.S. Saudi relationship needs to be reassessed. So how does that look if there is a changeover in administration? And how does that look if Saudi Arabia decides that it is going to hop on board and normalize relations with Israel? Do they kind of, get out of the deep end? What do the pieces look like on your board?
Well, we have countries all over the world just walking all over the United States today. Saudi Arabia is perhaps the most egregious example, given what they did to dismember and dispose of Jamal Khashoggi's body. But there are plenty of other countries who are abusing the United States and getting away with it. The Russians targeting U.S. troops inside Afghanistan, the Egyptians continuing to keep imprisoned U.S. citizens while the spigot of military aid continues unchecked. I mean, Vice President Biden is going to have to do something in his early days to make clear that there are consequences if you cross the United States. I argue that Saudi Arabia has to be on that list. I just don't understand how we don't eventually render any consequences for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. But I also think that Saudi Arabia has gotten away with many other malevolent behaviors. Every day that they continue to drop bombs in Yemen is a day that America is less safe, because Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula continues to be the group that has the clearest designs on attacking us. The general continued export of Salafist Wahhabism around the world, that continues to form the building blocks for extremist organizations that still have their sights set on the United States. I just, in general, think we need to have much tougher conversations with the Saudis. It doesn't mean that we walk away from our partnership with them. I just think we drive a harder bargain. I mean, we tend to think that, oh, if we stop selling some precision guided missiles to the Saudis, they're going to walk away from a defense partnership with the United States and go to the far inferior products produced in Russia and China. That's just not how it's going to work. We can get tougher with them, maintain an alliance, maintain the progress that is continuing to be made on normalization of relations with Israel, and get more out of that and many other relationships.
Do you want to put a finer point on do something, or you just want to leave it at that for now and you'll get there when you get there?
Do something. What the Biden administration should do. Well, I mean, listen. I obviously haven't shut up about the danger of our partnership with Saudi Arabia in Yemen, no matter what president is in the office. So I brought a motion to the floor of the Senate in the last year of Obama's administration, a privileged motion to pull the United States out of arms sales relationships with Saudi Arabia, and I will do the same thing in a Biden administration. So I think it would be obvious to them that I would hope one of the first things they would do is to end our military partnership with the Saudis in the Yemen civil war.
Gotcha. And then, when you try and prop up this idea of, using diplomacy where diplomacy is needed, instead of relying on the military when there is a political issue. How do you do that in countries where you can't get them to sit down to the table? I'm thinking, Syria, Venezuela, in some cases, North Korea, or when you sat down to the table, it hasn't worked. So how, what do you do there? Because the hawks are going to argue that you need the military to actually potentially, light the flame that could potentially bring them to the table. I assume you disagree, but how do you get them there?
Well, I argue that every time we use the U.S. military in the Middle East, we make our country less powerful. Because every time that we fail, and let's just be honest, right? We have completed part of our mission in these places, but we have never completed the full mission in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Syria, in Libya, in Yemen. Every time that we don't complete a mission, we make the United States look more feckless. So this idea that folks are, in the Middle East at least, scared of the American military, I don't think is rooted in historical fact. I think there's a different answer in each place, Kylie. I think in Venezuela, for instance, there really was a chance for a diplomatic solution there, but because this president cut off the normalization of relations with Cuba, and because he had a totally dysfunctional relationship with China, in which the only thing they could talk about was trade, we really didn't have the opportunity to be able to have a conversation with the two most important players, absent Russia, in Venezuela. So I think that there was a path to a diplomatic solution there that was just not available to this president. In a place like Syria, I have argued throughout this crisis that there likely was not an American-led solution in Syria, that perhaps our best play in Syria would have been sort of good old-fashioned restraint. If we were never really prepared to do what the Iranians and the Russians were willing to do, if it was always just a matter of time before Bashar al-Assad took back control of that country, why did we sort of play halfway for as long as we did? So sometimes I think there is a diplomatic option for a smarter president. Other places, I think we are just going to have less hubris about what we can accomplish in dangerous, far-off places where we understand very little about the political realities on the ground.
Yeah, I mean, can I ask you about that too? I mean, the hubris in going into some of the diplomatic conversations is applicable here, and I wonder, there have been some conversations that potentially, to get North Korea back to the table, what would be required is a recognition that they are not going to do away fully and verifiably with all of their nuclear weapons, but it has to be a conversation about how to keep eyes on them and permit them from using those weapons. Do you think that changing the basic way to enter that conversation could be valuable?
When I speak about hubris, and I'm generally talking about the hubris of U.S. military interventions, and I do agree with you that there is often hubris around what we can do diplomatically, but they are different in that the cost of failure of a diplomatic engagement is just fundamentally different than the cost of failure of a military engagement. This game we played in Syria for a long time under Obama and under Trump of sort of giving just enough support to the opposition to keep fighting, but never enough to win, ultimately just ended in more people dying. In North Korea, listen, I in the end, I was critical of the way the president engaged because it was just totally ham-handed, and he didn't do sort of the basic things necessary in order to have a diplomatic engagement like that come off successfully, like pre-negotiating before the two leaders meet. But I didn't kill him for the act of sitting down with a brutal dictator. And I also acknowledge that you are not going to get a complete and total agreement off the bat. You are going to have a confidence building agreement first with North Korea, as we did with Iran. It is going to be insufficient. It is going to draw criticism from folks who want more. But I think if Biden's going to engage with North Korea, he's going to have to be prepared to get very little at the outset in order to get a bigger deal. And as you mentioned, it may be a focus on verification at the beginning that gets you the opportunity for a larger deal down the line.
Yeah. Well, all things to consider. I do want to dive into some questions from the audience who's tuning in. Thank you guys for sending in questions. I am going to start with the first one here. The State Department has been decimated under this administration. What can the Senate do to help the State Department replenish its ranks, especially considering the budgetary environment of a Biden presidency? Especially considering the budgetary environment that a Biden presidency would encounter in January.
Well, there's a number of things we can do. Obviously, we're going to work with a Biden administration to just do some old-fashioned recruitment. There are a number of people who got dismissed or left of their own volition who still have many good years of service left on them, and we would like to get back some folks who just couldn't hack it or who got pushed out by the Trump administration. Second, I don't concede that the budget environment is going to disallow us from plussing up funding for the State Department. Remember, the State Department is what, $50-60 billion a year. The Department of Defense is $750 billion a year. We can absolutely sort of manage the rate of growth of the Defense Department and use some of those savings to plus up these non-military tools that I believe are so important for us to protect ourselves. I mean, we're going to have to spend money on global public health. We're going to have to show that we're serious when we rejoin the WHO, given the fact that China put in $2 billion. So I'm not ready to give up on the fact that we can put dollars in. And then lastly, we should look at some statutory relief for civil servants. We maybe need to give a little bit less discretion to the executive branch in terms of how they can target civil servants. And maybe one of the things we should look at, for instance, is putting some kind of cap on the number of political appointees that are put in ambassador posts. Maybe we want to formalize some of the rules that allow for spouses to stay together abroad. There are some signals we could take through statute change that would show we value career public servants.
Yeah, and they do talk about that a lot in Foggy Bottom. I wonder, one thing that you mentioned just in the answer there is potentially having some of these diplomats who have left U.S. government come back. So just to put a fine point on it, you are saying that a potential Biden administration should explicitly ask those folks to get back into government if they left during the Trump era.
Yeah, I don't have a list, but there are
Yeah.
some high-profile examples of individuals who have left on their own or who were sort of had their positions eliminated. Yes, I think that we're going to have to ask those folks to come back and hope that at least some of them answer the call.
Yeah. Another question from folks who are tuning in is about your City and State Diplomacy Act, why you introduced the bill, and would it build bridges between domestic and foreign policy?
Yeah, I'm glad people are paying attention to this. This is not always something that rises to the level of prominence as the daily deluge of headlines do. But I sort of think we've got to come up with this comprehensive suite of tools to be able to confront China. Again, I'm not talking about stopping China's increasing power. I think there's no way to do that. It's about meeting them, managing their rise. And right now, China does an enormous amount of city to city diplomacy, local leader to local leader diplomacy. That is one of their strengths, is that they don't see diplomats as just those that are in the foreign ministry. They use the multitude of Communist Party leadership in order to go around the world and sell the message of modern China. Why don't we do the same thing, right? I mean, we have frankly, hundreds of thousands of really smart Republicans and Democrats serving in state government and local government who love this country, who can tell a great story about this country, and who we should coordinate as they either convene formal or informal relationships with a number of countries around the world. I mean, am always in these countries who are telling me that they haven't had a visit, right, by an American president in 40 years, and they haven't seen the Secretary of State in 4 years. And while those visits are still important, if they were getting regular correspondence from lower level American leaders, it would at least show them that we place a priority on continuing that relationship. China's doing it. It's part of what helps them sort of swoop in and do these big economic deals. This would be a real sort of piece of low hanging fruit that the next president could pick off.
I mean, realistically, shouldn't members of Congress be the people doing that job? I mean, why should the onus lie on the State Department? Folks like yourself travel to the states you represent, meet with folks from the State Department in Washington. I mean, like, why should this be something that the State Department is expanding to focus on domestic policy? How important is it that they own this?
Well, it's important to know we're frankly just proposing to reestablish a capacity that the State Department used to have. It's obviously we do a lot of travel and we're important spokesmen for the United States, but why not use everybody? I think it's important for the State Department to coordinate this because you do want the State Department to prioritize the parts of the world in which this kind of local leader to local leader diplomacy is perhaps most effective. There are probably parts of the world in which this is not appropriate, and you really need to prioritize the relationship between the U.S. federal leadership and those governments. So I just think it's much more efficiently done if it's managed through the State Department.
Gotcha. I want to turn to another question from the audience on China's Belt and Road Initiative. It's heavily investing in infrastructure construction around the world. Is that a threat to U.S. interests and influence and opportunity for U.S.-China collaboration potentially? And should the U.S. try to match China's infrastructure spending or focus on other areas of developmental assistance? A few questions there for you in one.
Yeah, well, but I think it speaks to a really important conversation that we have not had, and that the Trump administration refuses to have, and that the Biden administration must have. What are the actual threats from China that we are seeking to counter? Are we trying to stop China from doing anything new in the world? Or are there specific advancements of Chinese power that we care most about? For instance, in the realm of technology, I know this wasn't the specific question, but in the realm of technology, exactly what are we trying to do, right? What are the actual dangers of China owning the information infrastructure? And once you identify what our actual interests are, it makes it easier to decide how to react. So I would answer the specific question in this way. I'm not sure that the United States cares about getting in the way of every investment from China around the
Right.
world. I think we have to be thoughtful uh, in a to answer the question more specifically. Much of the Belt and Road Initiative is terrible for climate. China may try to get credit for the new goals that they're setting domestically, but that is in part in order to whitewash the fact that much of this international development finance from China is being used to fund some of the dirtiest power development known to man today. And so that is why the United States should probably prioritize spending money through our own international development finance in building clean energy. Senator Johnson and I actually were successful in getting a $1 billion fund set up attached to the Development Finance Agency to do this in Russia's periphery. But that's a regional initiative. We should frankly be prioritizing that kind of finance as a counter-China strategy around the world. So let's just be specific about what we care about. And then tailor our solutions to it. That means we probably don't try to fight China everywhere on the Belt and Road Initiative. We prioritize certain of their investments, like dirty energy development.
And do you think infrastructure is an area that the U.S. could potentially work with China on?
Well, certainly. I mean, listen, I think you have to find ways to have a functional relationship with China because there are just some challenges we can't meet separately. And climate is obviously at the top of that list, but we go back to North Korea. I mean, there is no way that you are going to be able to unwind North Korea's nuclear program without China being at the table. And so, maybe you don't start with North Korea. You find other ways in which we can partner with the Chinese. Are they available for that cooperation? Certainly less so now than they were 10 years ago. They feel much more secure in their ability to do these kind of projects by themselves. But I don't think that there's any weakness in trying to, find some places where we can cooperate. It makes some of the other areas in which there's no choice but cooperation with China more possible.
And I know that you've been quite vocal in your opposition to the Trump administration's China policy. It's been a confusing one at that, given what they say and what the president has often done. But fundamentally, do you agree with the administration's national security strategy in 2017 that labeled China as a strategic competitor?
Well, yeah, they're certainly a strategic competitor. I guess I'm not a critic of the president's China policy because I don't think the president has a China policy, so I wouldn't even know what I was opposing. It's ham-handed, it's nonsensical. What the president says has zero connection to what the president actually does. I have argued, from the beginning that this president has been the best thing for China over the last 50 years. He's given them cover to brutally subjugate the Uyghurs. He has looked the other way largely as they have cracked down on Hong Kong. And for the first 2 to 3 months of the spread of COVID-19, he was their primary cheerleader, telling the world how wonderful China was doing in responding to the virus and how transparent their response had been. So yes, they are a competitor and we should treat them as such. But the president, I don't think, has effectuated a policy that actually seems connected to the defense strategy that he signed.
Yeah, the head isn't tied to the mouth all the time. All right, I'm going to go to another question from folks who are watching here. I think this is a good one. So, how can the Senate support efforts to diversify national security, specifically through the confirmation process?
In terms of personnel, well, I mean, this is, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, our representation abroad has to look like America. And especially at a moment when the rest of the world is, cringing, watching the United States mangle a developing second civil rights movement as this president is, turning the U.S. military on peaceful protesters and he's rooting on white supremacists. he frankly increases the burden that will be placed upon Vice President Biden if he wins to repair America's broken image, already broken, even more fractured now on race relations. So yes, the Senate can play a role here, but I think Vice President Biden is already committed to this. I think you will see more diverse candidates being put forward for senior State Department posts in a Biden administration. I think that's a commitment that they've already made.
Great. And this is going to be the last question. How do we integrate economics into a foreign policy that's increasingly determined by global supply chains and internet commerce? How could the United States make global economic policy work better for those other than the Wall Street class?
Well, I think two answers to that question. One, I'm a believer in trade deals, but we have literally been doing trade deals in the past, asking what's good for American companies instead of asking what's good for American workers. And so we have to have a worker first prism for all of our trade policies. Second, anytime that we are engaged in trade negotiations with a country like China, they have to be with our partners. So if you're going to make any progress with China on deciding who sets the rules of the road with regard to climate policy or product safety policy, we've got to do it with the Europeans. So I think those would be, as I see our timer marching down to zero, my two quick recommendations. Any trade negotiations have to be viewed through a worker prism, and nothing can be done with China without the United States getting on the same page with Europe first.
Senator Murphy, thank you so much. A very valuable discussion. Thanks for taking the time, especially on a crazy Friday, 1 week before Election Day. Appreciate it. And thanks to the Truman Center for having us dive into this discussion.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.